the Corsican outsider, and the Siege of Toulon. The late 18th century was defined by violent, unprecedented upheaval. The French Revolution of 1789 had shattered the ancient order of monarchies and aristocracy, unleashing a decade of chaos, terror, and relentless warfare across Europe. This environment of total rupture was not a danger to everyone. For the exceptionally ambitious and talented outsider, it was an unparalleled opportunity. That outsider was Napoleon born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. Napoleon's identity was immediately complex. France had only seized the island from Genoa a year before his birth. His family belonged to the poor, minor, Corsican nobility. As a child, he despised the French colonizers and was deeply influenced by the island's fierce nationalist leader, Pasquale Paoli, who fought for Corsican independence. This feeling of being an outsider, speaking Italian with a thick accent, and forever battling aristocratic French snobbery, fueled a powerful ambition and a need for self. This sense of alienation became his shield and his driving force. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to France for military education. He was often mocked for his accent and his height, forcing him to retreat into reading and academic study, while the sons of the wealthy aristocracy flocked to the more glamorous and less intellectually rigorous cavalry and infantry branches. Napoleon excelled in artillery and mathematics disciplines that required pure intellectual genius and precision rather than inherited rank. Artillery became his chosen field, a branch where promotion was earned by merit, not bloodline. When the revolution erupted, the resulting chaos tore the established aristocratic French army apart. Napoleon, a young officer, immediately saw his chance. A fierce supporter of the radical Jacobin, he threw himself into the political turmoil. The moment that changed his destiny, however, was purely military. The Siege of Toulon in 1793. Toulon was the primary French naval port on the Mediterranean, and it had been betrayed to the Royalists and their British, Spanish, and Neapolitan allies. The Republic desperately needed to retake the port. Napoleon, then a young, 24-year-old captain, arrived to find a disorganized Republican army ineptly attempting the siege. He immediately recognized that the conventional approach was pointless. He devised an ingenious plan. Instead of attacking the walls directly, he proposed placing his artillery cannons on a narrow peninsula, La Gillette, which dominated the harbor. From that position, the cannons could directly fire onto the British fleet anchored below, forcing them to abandon the harbor or face annihilation. Napoleon personally oversaw the dangerous construction of the battery, displaying reckless courage. Often fighting alongside his men, his plan was brilliant and devastatingly successful. The British and Royalists were forced to evacuate Toulon. Napoleon's strategic genius and decisive action were undeniable. He was rewarded with an immediate, extraordinary promotion to Brigadier General at the age of 24. His affiliation with the radical Jacobin briefly led to his arrest after the fall of Maximilien Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. But Napoleon was too talented to remain sidelined for long. His final political elevation came in 1795, when the Directory, the new, unstable government, faced a massive royalist mob uprising in the streets of Paris. The Directory desperately needed a commander who could act without hesitation. They turned to Napoleon. He famously ordered his artillery to fire grape-shot anti-personnel canister rounds directly into the dense crowds, turning the narrow streets into slaughterhouses. This decisive, brutal action, which Napoleon famously referred to as a whiff of grape shot, crushed the royalist rebellion in minutes. He had proven his political ruthlessness and his loyalty to the Republic. As a reward, the Directory made him a national hero and gave him command of the dilapidated army of Italy, a move they hoped would send the ambitious young general far away from Paris. They did not realize they had just handed him the key to world domination. The Italian campaign and the rise of the superstar general. In 1796, just days after marrying Josephine de Beauharnais, a charming, well-connected widow, with political leverage General Napoleon Bonaparte, now 26, departed for his new command, the Army of Italy. The Directory, his political masters, had intended this posting as a means of exile, hoping the ambitious young man would busy himself in a secondary theater of war. What they failed to grasp was that they had just given the greatest military mind of his generation a personal army and a continent to conquer. The army Napoleon inherited was a disgrace. 30,000 ragged, starving men, unpaid for months, whose uniforms were in tatters. They were demoralized, resentful, and viewed the war in Italy as a hopeless distraction. Napoleon immediately addressed their morale with a fiery proclamation. "Soldiers, you are ill-fed and almost naked. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great towns will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." He promised them wealth and glory, a contract he immediately began to fulfill. Napoleon revolutionized warfare in Italy through two core principles: speed and concentration of force. He abandoned the slow, cumbersome logistics of 18th century armies. His troops marched faster, carrying less baggage, enabling them to bypass large enemy fortresses and constantly outmaneuver the Austrian and Sardinian forces. While his enemies relied on predictable movements, Napoleon kept them perpetually off balance, striking their supply lines and concentrating his entire force on fragmented, enemy possessions strategy known as maneuver on interior lines. He paid his troops directly with plunder and tribute seized from the conquered Italian territories, ensuring their fierce, personal loyalty to him over the distant, politically unstable Directory. The campaign was a continuous chain of brilliant victories. At Montenoto, he split the Austrian and Sardinian armies. At Lodi, Napoleon personally led his troops across a deadly, exposed bridge under heavy fire. This act of reckless courage solidified his bond with the soldiers, who gave him the lifelong nickname, the Little Corporal, a sign of respect and affection for the general who fought like a common man. His legend grew further at Arcole, where he attempted to rally his panicked troops by grabbing the army standard and leading a charge across another bridge, only to be dragged back by his aides before being killed. His personal involvement in the thick of the fighting made him a mythical figure to his men. By 1797, in less than 2 years, Napoleon had entirely defeated the Austrians and Sardinians, forcing them to sue for peace. His success transformed the geopolitical map of Italy. He began acting not as a mere general of the Directory, but as an independent statesman. He created French client states, such as the Cisalpine Republic, and, without consultation from Paris, drafted and signed the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, which officially ended the War of the First Coalition and secured France major territorial gains. Critically, Napoleon understood the power of the press. He established his own newspapers, both for his troops and for the Parisian public. He tightly controlled the narrative, sending back carefully curated reports of his heroic exploits, turning himself into the first true superstar general of the modern age. He flooded the Directory's coffers with priceless Italian art and gold, keeping them financially dependent on him, while simultaneously demonstrating that he was a power above them. Having defeated the greatest European armies and established his own political domain, Napoleon returned to Paris, not as a subordinate, but as a political threat. The Directory was terrified, and they quickly sought a new, equally distant command for their overwhelmingly ambitious general. The Egyptian campaign and the coup of 80. Despite his overwhelming popularity, Napoleon's return from Italy in 1797 posed an immediate threat to the corrupt and incompetent Directory governing France. They needed to keep him busy, far from the capital, and preferably in a high-risk operation. The destination chosen was the East, the invasion of Egypt. The official rationale for the campaign was to cut the British trade lifeline to India and to establish a French colonial presence in the strategic Levant. However, for Napoleon, the appeal was far greater. It was a chance to emulate his hero, Alexander the Great, and secure a legendary status that transcended French politics. In 1798, he sailed with a massive fleet and 35,000 men, along with a battalion of scholars, scientists, and artists, a revolutionary merger of conquest and enlightenment. The campaign began with spectacular success. After capturing Malta, Napoleon landed in Egypt as his army approached Cairo, facing the formidable, traditional cavalry of the Mameluke. He delivered his famous address beneath the great monuments. Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. At the Battle of the Pyramids, July 1798, Napoleon demonstrated his tactical genius. He arranged his infantry into massive, hollow squares, highly disciplined defensive formations, impervious to cavalry charges. The Mamelukes, brave but technologically obsolete, broke against the squares, and Napoleon secured a swift and total victory, seizing Cairo and seemingly dominating the country. But the campaign's success was illusory. Just weeks later, disaster struck on the coast. The British Royal Navy, under the relentless command of Admiral Horatio Nelson, discovered the anchored French fleet in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile. Nelson executed a brilliant, daring maneuver, sailing part of his fleet between the French ships and the shore, trapping them in a deadly crossfire. The destruction was near total. The French fleet was annihilated, and Napoleon's army was stranded, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and communication with France, stranded in Egypt. Napoleon attempted to save the mission through expansion, launching a brutal march into Syria. This campaign was a failure. The Ottoman defenders, aided by British sea power, halted the French at the siege of Acre. Napoleon was forced into a bitter, humiliating retreat back to Egypt, abandoning his heavy equipment and leaving sick and wounded soldiers to their fate. The French army, plagued by disease and fatigue, was marooned in a desert prison. Despite the military catastrophe, Napoleon excelled at managing perception. He filtered the news, suppressing the full horror of the naval defeat and promoting his land victories and the incredible scientific discoveries like the Rosetta Stone made by his accompanying scholars. He maintained the facade of absolute command. Crucially, the political instability of the Directory back in France was reaching its peak. News, through censored newspapers and private letters, reached Napoleon that the Republic was failing, suffering defeats against the newly formed Second Coalition, Austria, Russia, Britain. He recognized the window of opportunity was closing. In August 1799, in the ultimate act of self-preservation, Napoleon secretly abandoned his army, leaving his command to General Kleber, and sailed back to France. His timing was perfect. He arrived to find a nation desperate for strong leadership, joining forces with key political conspirators, including the powerful Director Seyss. Napoleon orchestrated the coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799. He used his immense military prestige to cow the legislative councils and, when necessary, cleared the chamber with the bayonets of his loyal troops. The Directory was dissolved. In its place, the new government, the Consulate, was established, headed by 3 consuls. Napoleon, by force and political will, ensured that he was named first consul, effectively making him the supreme dictatorial ruler of France. The first step on the path to becoming emperor, consolidating power, Marengo, and the imperial crown. As first consul in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte held absolute power in France, but his position was precarious. He was surrounded by enemies, both domestic royalists who wished to restore the monarchy, and the foreign powers of the Second Coalition, especially Austria and Britain, who refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Republic. Napoleon's primary task was to secure the peace through decisive military victory, thereby legitimizing his seizure of power. In 1800, Napoleon personally led the army into his second, high-stakes Italian campaign. To surprise the Austrian forces entrenched in northern Italy, Napoleon took a risk that astonished all of Europe. He led his army, artillery, and baggage train on a brutal, audacious crossing of the Great St. Bernard passed through the snow-laden Alps. This maneuver, designed to emulate the great generals of antiquity, Hannibal and Alexander, was a masterstroke of logistics and morale. The resulting campaign culminated in the Battle of Marengo in June 800. The battle began disastrously for Napoleon. He had fatally underestimated the main Austrian force and was caught completely off guard, forced into a desperate, disorganized retreat. By mid-afternoon, Marengo appeared to be a decisive Austrian victory. The defeat of the first consul would have meant the immediate end of his political career, possibly his life, and the likely collapse of the French government. However, Napoleon's determination and the timely, last-minute arrival of reinforcements led by General Louis de Seix, who tragically died in the final charge, snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. De Seix's final counterattack reversed the rout, shattering the exhausted Austrian forces and transforming the battle into a glorious French triumph. The victory at Marengo secured France's borders, forced Austria into a new round of peace negotiations, and cemented Napoleon's image as the irreplaceable military savior of the nation. With military threats subdued, Napoleon turned his immense energy to the peaceful, but no less revolutionary, task of governance. He understood that long-term power required stability. He initiated a torrent of radical, centralized domestic reforms. He achieved reconciliation with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, reversing a decade of He centralized the nation's finances, creating the Bank of France. He established a national, secular system of education, and he launched ambitious public works projects to repair the infrastructure neglected during the Revolution. Napoleon's greatest and most enduring non-military achievement was the creation of the Code Civil, the Napoleonic Code in 1804. This unified legal framework swept away the patchwork of feudal, royal, and regional laws that had previously governed France. It institutionalized the core, stabilizing gains of the Revolution, equality of all men before the law, the abolition of hereditary privilege, and the clear protection of property rights. The Napoleonic Code was a monument to logic and clarity, and it would ultimately be adopted, in whole or in part, by dozens of nations across Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, cementing its place as Napoleon's most lasting legacy. Having secured military peace and implemented a legal revolution, Napoleon decided the title of First Consul was insufficient to ensure the stability of his reforms and prevent a return to the chaotic republic after his death. He decided to establish a new dynasty, following a carefully engineered national plebiscite. He had himself crowned Emperor of the French in December 1804 at Notre Dame Cathedral. In the most defining symbolic gesture of the era, Napoleon famously took the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it upon his own head. This act declared to the entire world that his authority came not from God, tradition, or the Church, but from himself and the will of the French people. Ultimate culmination of the revolutionary ideal, the Republic was dead. The French Empire had begun. Austerlitz, Trafalgar, and the apex of the empire, crowned emperor in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer merely a general of the Republic. He was a revolutionary monarch. This unprecedented ambition terrified the traditional ruling houses of Europe. In 1805, Britain, Russia, and Austria formed the Third Coalition, intent on dismantling the nascent French Empire and restoring the Bourbon monarchy. The resulting conflict would define Napoleon's genius and set the high water mark of his power. The year 1805 began with Napoleon planning the invasion of his greatest rival, Great Britain. He gathered the Armée d'Angleterre at Boulogne, awaiting the opportune moment to cross the English Channel. But Britain's defense was its mastery of the seas, a domain Napoleon never fully grasped. In October 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleets were confronted by the British Royal Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson off the coast of Spain. At Cape Nelson, defying naval convention, pierced the Franco-Spanish line in 2 columns, cutting off the command structure. The battle was a disaster for France. The Franco-Spanish fleet was almost completely destroyed, and Britain secured an undisputed naval supremacy that would last for a century. Though Nelson himself was killed in the action, the victory at Trafalgar ended any realistic French hope of invading Britain, and confirmed for Napoleon that he would have to defeat Britain not on the sea, but economically. Despite the naval disaster, Napoleon executed a swift strategic pivot, abandoning the invasion of Britain. He led his magnificent Grande Army, a highly trained, mobile, and motivated force on a lightning march across Europe, covering hundreds of miles in weeks. This surprise movement caught the Austrian army entirely off guard, forcing their surrender at Ulm without a major battle, a testament to Napoleon's strategic speed, known as the Ulm Maneuver. The campaign climaxed in the greatest military masterpiece of Napoleon's career, the Battle of Austerlitz, December 2, 1805, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, as Napoleon faced the combined forces of Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria. Facing a numerically superior enemy, Napoleon masterfully feigned weakness on his right flank, luring the Russian and Austrian commanders into attacking and stretching their center. As the Allies descended from the Pratzen Heights, Napoleon launched his true attack, piercing the weak enemy center with overwhelming force. The Allied line shattered. The victory was total, humiliating, and decisive. Austerlitz forced Austria out of the coalition and established Napoleon as the master of continental Europe. The following year, Saint-Hapyakurok saw the formation of the Fourth Coalition. Prussia, arrogantly relying on the legacy of Frederick the Great, made the fatal error of attacking Napoleon alone. In a campaign lasting only weeks, Napoleon annihilated the Prussian army in the twin battles of Jena and Auer. The defeat was so profound that Napoleon captured Berlin and erased Prussia as a major power almost overnight. With military victory secured, Napoleon returned to his plan for Britain. From Berlin, he decreed the Continental System 1806, comprehensive trade embargo, designed to paralyze the British economy by closing all European ports under French influence to British goods. This was Napoleon's attempt at economic world domination, aiming to starve Britain into submission. However, enforcing the continental system required control over every European coastline, an ambition that would inevitably drag him into disastrous, overstretched conflicts later in Spain and Russia. By 1807, following the victory over Russia at Friedland and the resulting Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon had reached the absolute zenith of his power. He controlled or dominated every state, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Russian border, installing his family members as client kings and ruling an empire larger and more influential than the Roman Empire had been for centuries. The Corsican outsider had become the unchallenged ruler of Europe. The two fatal mistakes: the Peninsular War and the invasion of Russia. Following the peak of his power in 1807, Emperor Napoleon began a period of overreach, committing to self-inflicted wounds that would ultimately drain his empire of its resources, men, and morale, paving the way for his eventual downfall. His quest for a total domination, primarily driven by the enforcement of the continental system, forced him to commit the very errors of overextension he had always sought to avoid. The first critical mistake began in 1808 with the Peninsular War. To secure the entire European coastline against British trade, Napoleon invaded his nominal ally Portugal, and then, inexcusably, deposed the Spanish Bourbon monarchy, installing his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. This act of blatant aggression triggered a massive, violent, and unprecedented popular uprising across Spain. The ensuing war was not a conventional conflict of set-piece battles. It was a brutal, decentralized, and dirty fight against citizen militias and partisans. The first widespread use of guerrilla warfare. Spanish for Little War. The French army, accustomed to fighting and defeating uniformed royal armies, found themselves trapped in a merciless, unwinnable conflict against a relentless civilian population. The British, under the brilliant General Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, provided constant military aid from Portugal. Napoleon himself would call the Peninsular War the Spanish ulcer, a festering wound that tied down hundreds of thousands of his best troops, bled his empire dry, and provided the first true hope to his European rivals. Adding to the instability, Napoleon faced a personal crisis. His wife Josephine could not give him the male heir necessary to secure the continuation of his dynasty. In 1809, in an act of political necessity and personal tragedy, he divorced Josephine and swiftly married Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of his defeated enemy, Emperor Francis II, in 1810. This dynastic marriage was intended to legitimize his rule in the eyes of Europe's old monarchies, and it quickly produced the longed-for heir, Napoleon II. Yet, the marriage was coldly political and alienated many loyalists who adored the charismatic Josephine. The second, and most fatal, mistake came in 1812 with the invasion of Russia. Saga, Vixando Ruai, unwilling to see his economy ruined by the continental system, resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon viewed this as an intolerable challenge to his supremacy. He assembled the Grande Army, a massive, multinational force of over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever witnessed, and crossed the Niemen River into Russia. Napoleon anticipated a quick, decisive battle that would force the Tsar to terms. Instead, the Russian command, under General Kutuzov, employed a brilliant strategic counter. Scorched earth tactics. They refused to give battle, retreating deeper into the Russian interior, burning crops, supplies, and villages as they went. The vast, empty landscape stretched Napoleon's supply lines to the breaking point. The only major engagement was the bloody, inconclusive battle of Borodino, which cost both sides massive casualties but failed to achieve the decisive victory Napoleon needed. He finally captured Moscow in September 8, only to find the city largely deserted and soon engulfed in flames, likely set by the retreating Russians. Napoleon waited weeks for a peace treaty that never came, realizing too late that his strategic goal, destroying the Russian army or forcing a surrender, was unattainable. Faced with the impending, brutal Russian winter, Napoleon ordered a disastrous retreat. The Grande Army was decimated, not by Russian soldiers, but by the cold, disease, and starvation. Cossack raids perpetually harassed the flanks, and the army was reduced to a miserable, freezing column of staggering, desperate men of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia. Barely 25,000 fighting soldiers managed to stumble back across the border. The catastrophe broke the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and provided the momentum for the rest of Europe to finally rise against him. The 100 Days, Waterloo, and the final exile. The catastrophic retreat from Russia in 1812 shattered the illusion of Napoleon's invincibility. Seeing the emperor desperately weakened, the remaining great powers of Europe, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, formed the Sixth Coalition in 1813, launching a coordinated, massive invasion to finally end the French Empire. Napoleon, demonstrating his political resilience, managed to raise a new army, but it consisted largely of young, inexperienced conscripts. Marie-Louise. The final great confrontation of this campaign occurred at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, in October 1813. Napoleon was faced with combined Allied forces that vastly outnumbered his own. The battle, the largest fought in Europe until World War I, lasted 3 days and resulted in a decisive, crushing defeat for the French. The Allies followed up their victory by invading France and capturing Paris in 1814. Napoleon, deserted by his marshals and facing overwhelming odds, was forced to abdicate unconditionally. In a dramatic personal moment, he attempted to commit suicide using a poisoned capsule he had carried since the retreat from Russia. But the poison had lost its potency, and he merely became violently ill. The victorious Allies exiled him to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, allowing him to retain the title of emperor and a small personal guard. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France under King Louis XVIII. Less than a year later, Napoleon observed the growing dissatisfaction of the French people with the return of the old royal order. He saw his chance. In February 1815, in one of history's most audacious acts, Napoleon escaped from Elba and landed on the southern coast of France, beginning the famous period known as the 100 Days. His return was a miracle of psychological warfare. Royalist troops sent to intercept him famously knelt and switched their allegiance, proclaiming, "I am your emperor. If there is a man among you who would kill his general, let him do so." Without firing a single shot, he marched triumphantly into Paris, sending Louis XVIII fleeing and reclaiming his throne. The European powers immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized the Seventh Coalition. The final, decisive confrontation occurred at Waterloo in Belgium on June 18, 1815. Napoleon faced the combined British army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army led by Field Marshal Blücher. The battle was a tactical masterpiece for the Allies, but a strategic disaster for Napoleon. Delay caused by heavy rain, poor communications, and Napoleon's failure to prevent the timely arrival of the Prussian forces proved fatal. As the battle raged, the sudden appearance of Blücher's Prussians on Napoleon's flank forced the desperate, final charge of the Imperial Guard. When the Guard was repulsed, the French army disintegrated into a catastrophic rout. Waterloo was the final, definitive end of Napoleon's reign. He returned to Paris and abdicated a second time. This time, the British made no mistake regarding his confinement. He was exiled to the incredibly remote, isolated island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, volcanic rock thousands of miles from Europe. There, under strict British supervision, he spent the last 6 years of his life dictating his memoirs and cultivating his own legend, often complaining of his isolation and poor health. Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena in 1821. Likely from stomach cancer. His life remains the ultimate paradox. A ruthless dictator whose wars cost millions of lives, yet the primary architect of modern legal, administrative and educational systems across Europe. His enduring legacy, the Napoleonic Code, and the concepts of efficiency and meritocracy outlived his empire, proving that, while his military ambitions were eventually crushed, his revolutionary ideas forever changed the course of Western civilization.